The glucose meter read 487. My hands shook as I checked again, hoping the first reading was wrong. 489. I fumbled for my insulin pen, clicking the dial to prepare my dose. Click, click. Nothing. Empty. "Mom!" I called out, my throat already dry from the ketones building in my blood. "Did my insulin delivery come today?" She appeared in the doorway, not making eye contact. "About that, sweetie. We had to cancel this month's order. Chloe's favourite band is having their farewell tour. The VIP packages went on sale this morning." Sarah Mitchell had been living with type 1 diabetes for as long as she could remember. At 38, she'd gotten used to the constant blood sugar checks, the endless insulin shots, and the delicate balance between food, exercise, and medication. She had learned to navigate the complexities of her illness, even when it felt like the world didn't understand. But today, as she checked her glucose meter, something felt off. The number blinked back at her. 487. Her heart skipped a beat and her hands began to shake. She tried to steady herself, clicking the meter again, hoping for a different result. But the screen flashed back, 489. Worse than before. The panic set in. She knew she was dangerously close to diabetic ketoacidosis. Without insulin, her body would start shutting down. She stumbled over to her insulin pen, but the click of the dial was hollow, empty. No insulin. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she felt the familiar dizziness take over. "Mom!" Sarah called, her voice cracking. Her mouth was dry, the bitter taste of ketones in her throat. "Did my insulin delivery come today?" The door creaked open, and there stood her mother, looking over her shoulder, avoiding eye contact. Sarah could see the hesitation in her eyes. Her mother's face was always one of concern, but today it was different. It felt distant. "About that, sweetie," her mother said, her voice strained. "We had to cancel this month's order. Chloe's favourite band is having their farewell tour. The VIP packages went on sale this morning." Sarah froze, the words sinking in like a cold wave crashing over her. The world around her blurred. She couldn't breathe. "What do you mean? You cancelled it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her mother shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. "Chloe's been dreaming of this concert for years. It's once in a lifetime, Sarah. We had to prioritise this. You can always ration what you have left, can't you? Maybe take a little less with each meal." Sarah's head spun. She felt a rage building up inside of her. "I could die," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the effort of holding back tears. "Without insulin, I will literally die." Her mother waved her hand dismissively, as if Sarah's life was just a passing inconvenience. "You're being dramatic, sweetie. People survived without all these modern medicines before. Maybe eat a little less carbs, just for a few weeks." Sarah felt her entire world collapse around her. She stood there, numb, as her mother walked away. "We're taking Chloe shopping for outfits for the concert tomorrow," she called over her shoulder, her tone casual, like they hadn't just shattered Sarah's world. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Sarah standing in the dark, her body fighting against the rising tide of desperation. Sarah stood frozen for a few moments, the words echoing in her mind like a cruel joke. Maybe eat less carbs for a few weeks. How could her mother be so callous? Sarah's vision blurred as she glanced down at her glucose meter again, 489. Her body was already slipping into danger, and here they were, her family, acting like it didn't matter. The weight of it all crashed down on her. The cruelty, the ignorance. They weren't just dismissing her needs. They were choosing to prioritise everything else over her survival. Chloe's concert, more important than Sarah's insulin. It felt like she had been invisible her entire life, but today it hit harder than ever. She wasn't just being ignored, she was being discarded. "Mom!" she shouted, running after her. "How could you do this?" But she was already gone. Downstairs, Sarah could hear the faint sound of her mother's voice, the sound of laughter, the sound of celebration as Chloe and her friends planned their night at the concert. It felt like her family had sealed their own fate, choosing to ignore the obvious truth. Without Sarah's insulin, she could die. And yet it seemed like they didn't care. Tears stung at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. No more. She couldn't be the one to suffer silently anymore. She retreated to her bedroom and closed the door. The silence in the room felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were pressing in on her. Sarah reached for her phone, fingers shaking as she scrolled through her contacts. Her friend, Sarah, would understand. She always did. She tapped on her name, hesitating for a moment before typing. "I need help. They've cancelled my insulin. I don't know what to do." Within seconds, Sarah received a reply. "What? They can't do that. Call me. I'm on my way." A sense of relief washed over Sarah. At least someone cared. She dialed her friend's number, clutching the phone to her ear as she waited for the call to connect. The ringing seemed to last forever before Sarah heard Sarah's voice on the other end. "Hey, Sarah, what's going on? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Sarah lied, trying to steady her voice. "But I need help. They've cancelled my insulin delivery. They're going to the concert instead." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah finally spoke again, her voice was low, filled with anger. "I won't let them get away with this. Not this time." Sarah's hand tightened around the phone as she listened to her friend's voice on the other end. "I'll be there soon," Sarah said, her tone firm. "I'm not going to let them just walk away from this." She hung up and sat down on her bed, the weight of the situation settling in. For the first time in years, she felt completely and utterly alone. Her family had always been difficult, but this was different. This was betrayal. She stood up and paced the room, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do? The pharmacy was closed for the weekend, and even if it weren't, her insulin was expensive, out of reach, without help. She could ration what little she had left, but it wouldn't last long. A few days at most. And then what? Sarah looked at her phone again. Her fingers hovered over the number for the pharmacy, but she knew there was no point. They wouldn't fill the prescription without her parents' approval. She thought about calling the doctor, but even that felt pointless. It wasn't just about the insulin, it was about what her family had done. The complete disregard for her life. She wasn't just some problem to be dealt with. She was their daughter. The doorbell rang. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she rushed to answer it. Standing in front of her was her friend Sarah, holding a bag filled with supplies and a look of determination on her face. "I'm not letting you do this alone," she said, stepping inside. "We'll figure it out, together." Sarah felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. At least someone cared. At least she wasn't completely invisible. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "What's next?" "We fight," Sarah replied. "We fight for you. We gather the evidence, and we make them face the consequences of their actions." It felt surreal, the idea of taking on her own family. But as she looked at her friend, she realized that it was the only choice she had left. If no one else would protect her, then she would have to protect herself. As they began to make a plan, Sarah felt a flicker of determination. It wasn't over yet, she wasn't finished, and no matter how much her family tried to ignore her, she would make them see, she would make them listen. The following days felt like a blur to Sarah. As much as she hated to admit it, she felt both physically and emotionally drained. Her body was fighting to stay strong without the insulin it desperately needed, but her resolve was unwavering. She couldn't let her family's betrayal destroy her, not when she had a chance to make things right. Sarah and her friend Sarah worked tirelessly together. They reached out to patient advocacy groups, medical professionals, and even social workers. Sarah was determined to gather all the information she could to prove that what her family had done was not only heartless, it was illegal. Late one night, Sarah sat hunched over her desk, the soft glow of her laptop illuminating the dark room. She had compiled dozens of documents, including hospital records, insulin orders, and her family's communication history. Every email, every text message where they had prioritized Jenna's concert over Sarah's health. She knew this was just the beginning, but it was a solid start. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but filled with concern as she glanced at Sarah's work. Sarah looked up, meeting her friend's gaze. She had to fight back the lump in her throat, but she managed a small, determined smile. "I have no choice. They've made it clear where I stand in their lives, and it's not fair. It's not just about the insulin, it's about the fact that they never really cared about me." Her friend nodded in agreement. "They're going to have to face the consequences, Sarah. You're not alone in this." The words were comforting, but Sarah knew it wouldn't be easy. Her parents had resources, and they would fight to cover up their mistakes. But as Sarah looked at the pile of evidence in front of her, she realized that this wasn't just her fight. It was for everyone who had ever been treated as less important than someone else. Everyone who had ever been forced to sacrifice their health for the whims of a family that didn't care enough to listen. The next morning, Sarah made a phone call that would set everything in motion. She called Melissa Chen, the patient advocate she had met months earlier at a doctor's appointment. Melissa had given her a business card with the promise to call if she ever faced medical neglect or discrimination. "Melissa," Sarah said when the call was answered, "it's Sarah Mitchell. I need your help. My family has been neglecting my health, and I can't let them get away with it." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by Melissa's calm, reassuring voice. "Tell me everything, Sarah. You're not alone in this." The days that followed were a blur of calls, paperwork, and strategy. Melissa, the patient advocate, immediately took charge, guiding Sarah through the next steps of building her case. Together they compiled a comprehensive file, one that included not only medical records, but also detailed messages between Sarah and her family, showing the exact moment they had chosen Jenna's concert over Sarah's health. Every time Sarah looked at the evidence, the anger surged again. How could they do this? How could they let something so trivial, something like a concert, be more important than her life? But now, with Melissa's help, Sarah could see a path forward. The support from the advocacy group was invaluable, and as Sarah's story spread to others, the flood of support began to grow. Messages of encouragement came pouring in, people who had faced similar neglect from their families, some even offering financial help to cover Sarah's medical expenses in the meantime. For the first time in days, Sarah felt like she wasn't alone. However, the more she thought about it, the more she realized just how deep the betrayal ran. She wasn't just fighting for her health, she was fighting to reclaim her dignity, to take back control of her life. Sarah started documenting everything. Every moment, every conversation with her parents, every instance where they dismissed her needs, the receipts for the concert tickets, the bank statements showing the money spent while she struggled to afford her insulin. Melissa had taught her that the more evidence they had, the stronger their case would be. But Sarah also knew that they needed to make a bigger impact. People needed to see just how far her family had gone. One evening, as she sat hunched over her desk, Sarah received a message from her best friend, Tara. Tara had heard about the situation from mutual friends, and being a journalist, she was eager to help. Tara's message was simple but direct. "Sarah, this needs to be a story. The world needs to know what they've done. I can help." It was a risk, but Sarah knew it was a risk worth taking. If she didn't act, nothing would change. She didn't want anyone else to go through what she had. If her family wouldn't change, she would make sure the world knew what had happened. "Tara, do it," Sarah responded, her heart pounding with the weight of what she was about to do. With that, the story of Sarah's family's neglect began to spread. The social media post went viral faster than Sarah could have ever anticipated. It wasn't just about the concert or her insulin. It was about a system that allowed families to prioritize their own desires over the health of their loved ones. Soon, News outlets began reaching out. Reporters were asking for interviews, wanting to learn more about Sarah's fight for justice. The media attention was overwhelming. Sarah was now the face of a movement she never expected to lead. What started as a personal battle against her own family had become a symbol of a larger issue: how many people with chronic illnesses were treated as secondary to their family's desires. Her inbox filled with messages of support, some from strangers who had been in her shoes, others from healthcare professionals who applauded her courage. But not all attention was positive. Her family, of course, was furious. They couldn't fathom why Sarah would expose their private lives to the world. Her mother had called her several times, leaving angry voicemails, telling her she was making a huge mistake. "This will ruin everything, Sarah," her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Why are you doing this? We were just trying to make your sister happy." But it was the message from her father that made her stomach churn. It wasn't the anger that stung, it was the coldness. "You've crossed a line. You won't be part of this family anymore if you continue down this path. I suggest you rethink your choices." It was a threat, clear and sharp. Sarah felt the pressure mounting, but instead of fear, there was something else: relief. The truth was out there now, and it couldn't be taken back. Sarah had no choice but to keep moving forward. Her lawyer, David, had been busy preparing for the legal battle, gathering all the evidence Sarah had collected. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that her family had neglected not only her health, but their legal responsibilities as well. Sarah's case had quickly turned from a simple matter of medical neglect to something much bigger: medical negligence and reckless endangerment. She wasn't just asking for restitution for the money spent on her medical care. She was asking for accountability, for the emotional damage and the years of neglect. Her next step was to file a formal complaint with the local medical board, detailing her family's actions, and to push for changes in the way insurance and medical coverage were handled in cases of familial neglect. If she could help one other person avoid what she'd gone through, it would be worth it. The real challenge, however, was still to come. While her family continued to rage against her publicly, Sarah knew she needed more than just media attention to win. She needed to focus. She needed to stay strong. As the weeks went by, Sarah started receiving invitations to speak at conferences and panels. She had become a spokesperson for those who suffered in silence, and as strange as it felt, she couldn't deny how much the support was fueling her. She had a purpose now. This wasn't just about getting justice for herself. It was about giving a voice to people like her, those who had suffered and had no way of speaking up. But as the fight continued, she felt a nagging anxiety. What would her family do next? Could they silence her? Could they destroy her chance for justice? The moment of reckoning was approaching, and Sarah wasn't sure what the outcome would be. But she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't backing down. The days leading up to the trial were filled with anxiety and anticipation. Sarah could feel the weight of the coming battle pressing down on her, and yet, as the moment of truth drew closer, something inside her hardened. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, for those whose voices were stifled by the people who were supposed to protect them the most. Sarah had gathered every shred of evidence. She had painstakingly gone through her texts, emails, receipts, medical records, and even social media posts to prove that her family's actions had not only been negligent, but downright reckless. Her lawyer, David, had helped her file the necessary paperwork for the legal battle ahead, and now, with everything in place, there was nothing left to do but wait. And as she waited, Sarah couldn't help but wonder about her family. What were they thinking? Had they truly not realized the gravity of their actions, or were they simply too ashamed to admit the truth? Every call, every message from them seemed like a desperate attempt to salvage something they couldn't control. They were scrambling, looking for any way to avoid the consequences of their choices. But Sarah was no longer the scared, overlooked daughter who had always tried to keep the peace. She was different now. She had her voice back. and she wasn't about to let anyone, least of all her family, take that away from her. Then, out of nowhere, she received a phone call that sent a chill down her spine. It was from Jenna. "Sarah," Jenna's voice trembled on the other end. "I'm sorry. I never thought it would go this far. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this, but she didn't know how to react. Was this an apology? Was it just guilt? Was her sister trying to manipulate her? "I'm not doing this for you, Chloe," Sarah replied, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. You never saw it. You never saw how much I've struggled because of what you and Mum and Dad did, but now I'm making sure it stops, for everyone else." There was a long pause before Jenna spoke again. I can't undo what's been done, but I want you to know I was wrong. I should have seen it sooner. I can't change what happened, but I can at least stand by you now." Sarah swallowed hard. Could she trust Jenna? Could she forgive her? Could she even forgive her parents? Before Sarah could respond, the sound of a door opening broke the moment. Her mother's voice floated up from the stairs. "Who are you talking to, Chloe?" Jenna's voice dropped to a whisper. "I have to go. We'll talk soon, okay?" As the line went dead, Sarah felt the weight of the conversation linger. Was it too late for reconciliation? Would the truth set her free, or would it destroy what little remained of her family? She had no answers, only questions. But Sarah knew one thing. The battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The next few days were a blur of preparations and emotions. Sarah had managed to keep her composure in the face of her family's attempts to guilt-trip her into backing down, but the weight of the situation never seemed to ease. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of her parents and sister, a reflection of the people she had once trusted above all else. Despite the emotional toll, Sarah knew she couldn't stop now. She had to keep moving forward, not just for her own sake, but for everyone who had ever been neglected by their family in the name of selfishness. She was determined to prove that no one, not even family, had the right to abandon someone in their time of need. The morning of the hearing arrived faster than Sarah had anticipated. Her heart raced as she dressed in a professional outfit, one that felt foreign and stiff. It was the first time she'd ever been in a courtroom, and as much as she tried to push down the nerves, she couldn't help but feel the gravity of the situation. When Sarah walked into the courthouse, she was greeted by the familiar, overwhelming sense of cold, sterile efficiency. Her lawyer, David, was already waiting for her. He gave her a reassuring nod, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his face. They had prepared for this moment, but the unknown still loomed large. As Sarah took her seat in the waiting area, she tried to steady her breath. She could hear the distant murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet on the cold, hard floors, and the occasional cough. It all seemed so distant, as though she was outside of herself, watching it all unfold from a distance. But then she saw them, her parents. They walked into the courtroom, heads held high, as if they were the victims in all of this. Her mother's face was set in that familiar defensive expression, the one she always wore when she didn't want to show weakness. Her father, though, had the unmistakable look of someone who felt entitled to control the situation. He glanced over at Sarah with a look that could only be described as disdain, as if she was the one causing all this trouble. For a moment, Sarah's heart dropped. The sheer audacity of their presence in that room, as though they had done nothing wrong, was overwhelming. But then something shifted within her. It wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. She wasn't here to fix them. She wasn't here to beg them for an apology. She was here for herself. She was here to make sure they faced the consequences of their actions. Her heart steadied, her mind sharpened. This wasn't just a courtroom battle. It was the fight for her life, her voice, and her future. As the proceedings began, Sarah felt a calmness settle over her. The opening statements were made, the evidence was presented, and soon it was her turn to speak. She rose from her seat, her legs slightly trembling, but her resolve unshaken. Her voice, though shaky at first, grew steadier with each word as she told the court exactly what had happened. She spoke of the years of neglect, the countless times her needs had been brushed aside, the decision that had put her life in danger, all in favour of a concert ticket. By the time she finished, there was no doubt in anyone's mind what had happened. Sarah had laid it all bare. And as she sat down, she knew one thing for certain. This was her turning point. There was no going back now. As Sarah sat down, her hands trembling slightly from the weight of what she had just shared, she realised the enormity of the moment. The room was quiet, the tension palpable. Her parents sat across from her, their faces a mix of disbelief and irritation. They hadn't expected her to be so forceful, so resolute. But Sarah had reached the point of no return. There was no turning back now. The judge leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "Thank you, Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We will now proceed with the defence." Sarah's parents' lawyer stood up, adjusting his tie, and approached the front of the courtroom with a look of practised confidence. Sarah could feel her stomach twist in knots. She knew what was coming. He would attempt to paint her as irrational, as a drama queen. He would try to make her look like someone who was exaggerating the truth, trying to manipulate the situation to gain attention. But Sarah wouldn't let that happen. She'd already been dismissed by them for too long. This time she wasn't going to let anyone belittle her. She had taken the first step, and now she was going to finish it. The defence attorney began with his opening statement, outlining how Sarah had been given insulin in the past and how her family had made attempts to help her despite their financial constraints. He attempted to argue that the concert was a special event, something that meant a lot to the family, and that Sarah had simply misunderstood the situation. He tried to make it seem like it was a simple mistake, a misjudgment that had spiralled out of control, but Sarah's lawyer was prepared for this. David stood up and countered, listing all the evidence that proved how this was not a simple mistake. The medical records showing the urgency of Sarah's condition, the messages from her family that demonstrated their prioritization of Jenna's concert over Sarah's health, the conversations where Sarah's concerns had been dismissed, the moments when her family had been more concerned about image than her well-being. The turning point in the trial came when Sarah's mother took the stand. Her voice was shaky as she began to speak, but Sarah could see the way she tried to compose herself. Her mother's words, though carefully chosen, only deepened the divide. She explained how she had prioritized Jenna's dreams, and despite knowing Sarah's health was at risk, she justified her actions by the belief that everyone has to make sacrifices. Sarah felt her blood run cold as she listened. There it was, the truth, laid bare. Her mother's words made it clear that Sarah was never truly a priority. She was just something to be dealt with when it was convenient. As the defense lawyer finished cross-examining Sarah's mother, Sarah could feel the entire room shift. The audience was beginning to grasp the gravity of what had transpired. She had done what she needed to do. She had exposed the lies, the neglect, the indifference. It wasn't just her family's actions that were under scrutiny now. It was the system that allowed this kind of neglect to happen over and over again. When the trial adjourned for the day, Sarah walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. She wasn't sure how the case would unfold, but she knew she had done everything in her power. And that was enough. The days following the trial were filled with a tense, heavy silence. Sarah had done what she needed to do. She had told her story, laid bare the betrayals, and stood up for herself in a way she never had before. But now, as she sat at home, waiting for the next steps, she could feel the aftershocks of her actions rippling through every aspect of her life. Her family was furious. Her mother refused to speak to her. Her father, usually so calm and composed, had sent one final text message, blaming her for everything that had gone wrong. He said that she had ruined the family, that her need for attention had cost them everything. For a moment, Sarah wondered if it had been worth it. But as she looked down at the pile of evidence, her medical records, the messages, the emails, the receipts, she knew. She wasn't the one who had destroyed the family. They had destroyed her. The media, on the other hand, had picked up on her story, and it was spreading like wildfire. As Sarah's story was shared on social media, people began to flood her inbox with messages of support. It was overwhelming, and yet it was the only thing keeping her from breaking down completely. Strangers were thanking her for speaking out, telling her that her courage had inspired them. But there was one message that stood out. It came from Melissa Chen, the patient advocate who had helped Sarah navigate this entire process. The message was simple: I'm proud of you. You've done something many couldn't, but the fight isn't over. It was that reminder, the fight isn't over, that kept Sarah going. She had taken the first step, but now she had to ensure that what had happened to her wouldn't happen to anyone else. She wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. The court case was still pending, and Sarah knew that her family would pull out every stop to avoid consequences. They had money and influence, and they would try to bury the truth if they could. But Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't going to let her parents' power and wealth drown out her voice. One evening, as Sarah was reflecting on everything, she received a phone call from Tara, her best friend and journalist. Tara's voice was tense as she spoke. Sarah, the press is digging deeper. I've received some calls from journalists who are looking into your case even more. They want to know about your medical journey, about how your family's actions affected your health. We could turn this into something even bigger, national attention. Sarah's heart raced. The idea of more publicity terrified her, but she knew that if it could help expose the broader issue of medical neglect, she had to do it. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored by their loved ones in times of crisis. Let's do it, Sarah said, her voice steady now. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Tara promised to help her organise a series of interviews. With national attention came the opportunity to reach more people who might be going through the same thing and didn't have a voice. Sarah wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been overlooked, neglected and discarded. She wasn't alone anymore. She never would be again. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to feel the full weight of her decision. The interviews, the press releases, the camera crews, all of it felt overwhelming at times. But with every new story, with every new person who came forward to share their own struggles, Sarah knew it was worth it. The more she spoke, the more the truth gained traction. People began to understand what she had gone through, what so many others had gone through in silence. But as the media buzzed around her, Sarah's family remained silent. No calls, no apologies, just a cold, unmistakable silence that spoke volumes. Her mother's voice no longer appeared in her voicemail inbox. Her father's angry texts had stopped. Even Jenna, who had initially expressed guilt, seemed to have vanished. It was as if her family had made a collective decision to erase her from their lives. It hurt more than Sarah had anticipated, but it was also a liberation she hadn't expected. As painful as it was to see the hole where her family had once been, Sarah realized she was finally free. Free from their manipulation, their demands, and most of all, their indifference. The legal battle, however, wasn't over. The next hearing was approaching, and Sarah knew that her parents would fight tooth and nail to avoid responsibility. They had already hired a new set of lawyers, ones that were known for their aggressive tactics. Sarah had no illusions. This was going to get ugly, but she was ready. A week before the next hearing, Sarah sat down with David, her lawyer, to prepare for what was coming. The evidence was solid, but Sarah couldn't help but feel a nagging doubt in the pit of her stomach. What if they tried to turn the tide against her? What if they made her look like the villain? David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You've done everything right, Sarah. We've got the facts, the evidence, and the public support. Your parents can deny it all they want, but the truth will win." Sarah nodded, but her mind was still racing. The thought of seeing her family in that courtroom again made her feel like a stranger in her own life. They had been the ones to abandon her, but here she was, standing tall and fighting back. The day of the hearing arrived, and Sarah felt a mix of anxiety and determination. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from various outlets were seated along the walls, their cameras ready to capture every moment. It felt surreal. This was no longer just a fight for justice. It had become a public spectacle. When her parents walked into the courtroom, it was like the air thickened. They were no longer the parents Sarah had once trusted. They were the ones who had hurt her, and now they would face the consequences of their actions. Her father tried to make eye contact with Sarah, but she refused to look at him. She had nothing left to say to him. Her mother, still trying to hold on to some semblance of control, gave her a cold stare, but it didn't faze Sarah anymore. She had already made her decision. As the trial progressed, the evidence Sarah had painstakingly collected was presented once more. The room grew tense as the defense attempted to downplay their actions, but this time, Sarah felt something different in the air. The audience was on her side, and even the judge seemed increasingly skeptical of her parents' defense. By the time the session adjourned, Sarah felt a sense of clarity. She had done everything she could. The truth was out there, and it was up to the courts now. But regardless of the outcome, she knew one thing. She had reclaimed her voice, and she would never let anyone silence her again. The final days before the verdict arrived were the hardest. Sarah spent her time oscillating between exhaustion and a newfound sense of strength. The media coverage was non-stop, and Sarah had become something of a public figure, a symbol of resilience for people who had felt discarded by their own families. But as the days dragged on, she couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter what happened in court, this wouldn't be over. Her phone buzzed constantly, messages from people thanking her for speaking out, others sharing their own painful stories of neglect. Some were hopeful, others angry, and there were even a few messages from people who had no idea what it was like to live with a chronic illness, offering support, but inadvertently making it clear they still didn't fully understand her struggle. But as Sarah sat in her apartment, scrolling through her phone one night, there was one message that stood out. It was from Tara, her best friend and journalist. It simply said, "They've made a statement. Your parents are denying everything. They're calling you a liar." Sarah's heart sank. She'd known they would do this. They were trying to control the narrative. They were trying to rewrite history, erase the truth. Her stomach churned as she read through their official statement, their words filled with arrogance and self-righteousness. "We never intended to harm our daughter. This entire situation has been blown out of proportion, and we are deeply saddened that Sarah has taken this to such an extreme." It was everything Sarah had feared. They were painting her as the villain, as the one who had overreacted. They were trying to gaslight her, to make it seem as if she was the one tearing the family apart. But the fury that rose in her wasn't one of defeat. It was a fire that burned hotter now than ever before. Sarah wasn't going to let them get away with this. They could deny all they wanted, but the truth was already out. She had exposed them. She had already told the world what they had done. That night, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, her thoughts racing. Her parents had no idea what they were up against. They thought they could silence her, shame her into backing down. But Sarah had learned something invaluable in the past few months. No one could take away her voice unless she let them. When the day of the final hearing arrived, Sarah entered the courtroom with a calm resolve. There was a quiet confidence in her steps, a sense of determination that she hadn't felt before. It was no longer just about her. It was about the thousands of people who had reached out to her, the ones who had been hurt in silence, the ones who hadn't known how to stand up for themselves. As the judge called the court to order, Sarah glanced over at her family. Her mother's face was tight with anger, her father staring at the floor, avoiding her gaze. Jenna wasn't there. Sarah didn't care. The family she once knew was gone, and in its place there was nothing but the cold remnants of betrayal. The court proceedings were tense, the air thick with anticipation. The defense continued to deny everything, but Sarah could feel the tide shifting. With each new piece of evidence, the walls around her parents' defense crumbled. Sarah spoke with conviction when asked to take the stand again, outlining the emotional toll their actions had taken on her. The words came easily now, no longer choked by fear or self-doubt. When the judge called for a recess, Sarah knew this was it. The final moments before the verdict. She had done everything she could. She had stood her ground, and now all she could do was wait for the decision. As she stood outside the courtroom, looking out at the busy street, she realized something. Win or lose, this battle had already changed her. She was no longer the person who hid in the background, the one who quietly suffered. She was Sarah Mitchell, and she had fought for her life, and nothing could take that away from her. The waiting felt endless. Sarah sat in the crowded courthouse lobby, her legs restless beneath her. The hum of voices around her seemed distant, as if they were part of someone else's world. This was her world now, silent, heavy, and full of anticipation. She couldn't escape the constant replay of everything that had led her here. Her family's betrayal, the months of fighting, of pushing through doubt and fear. She had put everything on the line, and now all she could do was wait. The sound of the door opening pulled her back to the present. David, her lawyer, stepped through, his expression unreadable. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as he walked toward her. "It's over," David said softly, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't need to say more. She could read the weight in his words. The decision had been made. Her mind raced. What had the judge decided? Would she finally get the justice she deserved, or would her family's denial win? She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to steady her breath. "The judge is ready to make a statement," David continued. "You should be there when it's announced." Sarah nodded, standing slowly. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she couldn't let fear hold her back now. As they walked back into the courtroom, her parents were already seated, their faces drawn and pale. Jenna was nowhere to be seen, and for the first time, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace. The family she had once known was already a thing of the past. The judge, an older man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, stood and addressed the room. "After careful consideration of all the evidence presented," he began, his voice steady, "the court finds in favour of the plaintiff, Sarah Mitchell. The court rules that her family, in particular her parents, acted with negligence and reckless disregard for her health. The decision to prioritise the concert tickets over Sarah's medical needs constitutes a clear violation of their responsibility to provide for her well-being." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. For a moment it felt like time stood still. The weight of the ruling slowly sank in. She had won. The judge continued. "In addition to the ruling, the court orders the defendant to pay restitution for all medical bills incurred, as well as compensation for emotional distress. Further, a restraining order will be placed to prevent further contact with the plaintiff unless authorized by her." A flood of emotions rushed through Sarah. Relief, triumph, and something she hadn't felt in years, validation. She had fought for herself, and now the world knew the truth. Her family's actions would no longer be swept under the rug. As the judge finished his statement, Sarah's parents remained silent, their faces expressionless. Sarah didn't need to see their reaction to know how they felt. She knew they would never understand. They hadn't seen her for who she truly was, and now they never would. She had no illusions about reconciliation. The damage was done, and she was done with them. David placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "You did it, Sarah. You won. It's over." But for Sarah, it wasn't truly over. This victory wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. She had found her voice, and now she would use it to make sure no one else had to suffer in silence the way she had. In the days following the verdict, Sarah found herself surrounded by a whirlwind of emotions. The press coverage, while a reminder of how far her story had reached, also brought with it an unsettling feeling. She had won the battle in court, but now the real work began. She had taken on her family, her parents, and the system, but there was still so much to do. The attention, while empowering, was overwhelming. Everyone wanted to know her story, but Sarah found herself questioning if she was truly ready to bear the full weight of it. Despite the sense of relief that came with the judgment, there were moments when Sarah felt strangely empty. Her family had been the cornerstone of her life for so long, and even though they had hurt her deeply, there was still a part of her that mourned the loss. The echoes of what could have been, the image of a family that never truly existed, kept lingering at the back of her mind. One afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table, the sunlight streaming through the window, casting long shadows on the walls. She had spent the morning reading through the details of the court order, her parents' restitution, the medical expenses they would be required to pay. It was satisfying in a way, but she felt a gnawing sense of something more important. Healing. That evening, Sarah received a call from Tara, who had been her steadfast support throughout the entire ordeal. "Hey, Sarah," Tara said with her usual energy. "How are you holding up? Have you had time to process everything?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, gazing out the window. "It's a lot. I thought I'd feel better, but it's like, now what? I've won, but I still feel kind of lost." "I get that," Tara replied. "You've spent so much time fighting that it's hard to know what to do now that the fight is over. But remember, this victory doesn't just mean the case is closed. It means you've taken control of your life. You're free, Sarah, and that's huge." Sarah smiled, though it felt bittersweet. "It's still hard to feel that way. It's like I have to rebuild everything. A life I never really had. A family I never had." Tara was quiet for a moment. "It's okay to grieve, Sarah, but don't forget, this is your chance to create the life you want, the way you want it. You've already proven how strong you are. You have a whole community of people who support you now. You're not alone." The words lingered in Sarah's mind long after the call ended. She wasn't alone. She had people who believed in her, people who had seen the truth and stood by her side. She had taken her power back, and now it was time to truly heal. Sarah started looking into ways to give back to the community. She began working with patient advocacy groups, sharing her story with others who had been affected by medical neglect. She became an active voice in the fight for better healthcare policies for people with chronic illnesses, making sure that no one else would have to go through what she had. With every interview, every speech, Sarah felt more whole. She wasn't just rebuilding herself, she was helping others do the same. She found purpose in the mission that had grown from her pain. It was clear now that the fight had never been just about her. It had been about creating a space where no one was ignored, where no one's life was dismissed because they were deemed less important. Sarah was moving forward piece by piece, and though the scars of the past would always be there, they no longer defined her. She had survived the worst, and now she was stronger because of it. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself navigating a strange new reality. Her life, once defined by the chaos of her family's neglect, was now centered on her own healing, her own future. It felt like a paradox. She had gained so much freedom, yet there was a deep ache where her family used to be. No amount of media attention or public recognition could fill the emptiness left by their abandonment. But Sarah refused to allow herself to be consumed by this grief. She had learned too much during her battle to be defined by the past. She had witnessed her own strength in the face of unimaginable hardship. And now, with the weight of the legal victory behind her, it was time to truly reclaim her life. Her first step was attending therapy. She had put it off for so long, believing she could handle everything on her own. but she quickly realized that healing wasn't something you could do alone. Talking through her pain, her anger, and her fear was liberating. It gave her clarity she hadn't known she needed. Her therapist encouraged her to explore the idea of forgiveness, not necessarily for her family's sake, but for her own peace of mind. Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for that. Forgiveness felt like something she might never be able to offer them. But she understood the importance of releasing the hold her family's actions had over her heart. Through therapy, Sarah also began volunteering at local support groups for individuals with chronic illnesses. Speaking to others who had faced neglect, discrimination, and abuse, she found herself drawn into their stories. Each person she met reminded her of her own struggles, but also of her resilience. She wasn't just a survivor of medical neglect. She was a beacon for those who hadn't yet found their voice. One evening, after a particularly moving group session, Sarah received an unexpected message. It was from Jenna, her sister. "Sarah, I know we haven't spoken in a while, but I've been thinking about everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm truly sorry. I didn't understand then, but I see now what you went through. I don't know how to make it right, but I hope you'll let me try." For a moment, Sarah simply stared at the message. A part of her wanted to ignore it, to tell Jenna that it was too late, that nothing could undo the harm. But as she read the words again, she felt something shift inside her. She had spent so much of her life trying to make things right for everyone else, but this was different. It was her turn to decide what was right for her. She took a deep breath, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure of what to say. Finally, after a long pause, she typed her response. "Jenna, I appreciate your apology. It doesn't erase what happened, but it's a start. I'm not ready to forgive yet, and maybe I never will be. But I'm healing, and I'm doing this for me. I hope you understand." As Sarah hit send, a sense of closure washed over her. She wasn't ready to open the door to her family again, but she knew that forgiveness, if it came, would come on her own terms. The process of healing was slow, but it was steady. With each passing day, Sarah found new strength. She no longer needed to prove anything to her family. She no longer needed their approval. She was carving her own path now, one where her health, her happiness, and her voice were the priority. And so, as Sarah continued to build a new life, she knew that her story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The scars of the past would always be with her, but they no longer held her captive. She had freed herself, and in doing so, had found a peace she never thought possible. As Sarah continued to rebuild her life, she began to feel the seeds of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that was naive or fragile. It was the kind of hope that grew stronger each time she overcame an obstacle, every time she pushed through the fear and uncertainty. It was the hope of someone who had endured and survived, who knew that even the darkest chapters could lead to something brighter. Her work with the support groups grew. Sarah began organising workshops, sharing her journey, and providing resources for others struggling with medical neglect. Her voice became a powerful tool, one she used to bring light to the silent battles others were facing. She found purpose in helping those who, like her, had once felt invisible. She was no longer the woman who had been abandoned by her family. She was the advocate for those who were still fighting, still struggling to find a way out of the darkness. One day, Sarah received a letter that would change the course of her journey. It was from the hospital that had treated her during the worst of her medical crises. They had learned about her story through the press and the work she was doing to bring awareness to patient neglect. They wanted to offer her a role as a patient liaison, someone who could speak directly to patients, listen to their concerns, and work with the hospital administration to improve the quality of care. The offer took Sarah by surprise. She had never considered working in the healthcare field before, but as she read through the details of the job, she realised it was the perfect fit. It was a way for her to take everything she had learned, everything she had fought for, and use it to create real change. It wasn't just about her story anymore. It was about transforming the system, making sure that no patient would ever feel ignored or abandoned again. But Sarah also knew that this was a turning point. Taking the job meant stepping fully into a new life, one that would challenge her in ways she couldn't predict. She had always worked hard to maintain control, to push herself forward despite the odds. But this role would require her to collaborate with a team, to navigate the complexities of hospital bureaucracy, and to keep fighting for patients in ways she had never done before. It was daunting, but for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt excitement stir within her. She was stepping into something bigger than herself. She wasn't just advocating for her own healing anymore. She was advocating for the healing of an entire system that had failed her and countless others. When Sarah accepted the role, she knew it was a risk. She knew it would be difficult, but she was ready. This was the next chapter in her redemption, and it was one that held the promise of not just personal growth, but systemic change. As she walked into the hospital for her first day of work, Sarah felt a surge of pride. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And in that moment, she realized something else. Redemption wasn't just about what you gained, it was about what you gave back to the world. Sarah's first few weeks at the hospital were a whirlwind. She was learning the ins and outs of the administrative side of healthcare, how the system worked, the challenges it faced, and most importantly, how patients navigated it. She met with staff, observed patient interactions, and listened to countless stories of neglect, indifference, and unspoken struggles. Each story felt like a mirror to her own. It reinforced everything she had been fighting for, and it gave her the clarity she needed to keep pushing forward. Her role was unique. Sarah wasn't just a liaison between patients and medical staff. She was the bridge between the voices that were often ignored and the professionals who had the power to make changes. It was a delicate balance, but Sarah was good at it. She knew the pain of feeling dismissed, of being treated like a number instead of a person. She knew how powerful it could be to simply have someone listen. As weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself becoming more involved in the decision-making process at the hospital. She started advocating for policy changes that would prioritise patient care, especially for those with chronic illnesses like hers. She worked on initiatives to ensure that patients who needed long-term treatment or medication were given the proper support without the financial and emotional burden that had once almost crushed her. One afternoon, while meeting with a group of healthcare professionals about a new initiative to improve diabetic care, Sarah was struck by how much had changed in her own perspective. The woman who had walked into that courtroom, trembling and terrified, was no longer the woman sitting in this room. She was confident, grounded, and determined. The woman who had once been silenced by her family's indifference was now the voice of reason in a room full of experts. As Sarah spoke, she could see the shift in the room. The doctors, nurses, and administrators were beginning to listen. They were understanding the needs of the patients they served in a way they hadn't before. Sarah was making a difference, and it wasn't just about her. She was helping change the system. One day, as she was preparing for a speech at an upcoming healthcare conference, Sarah received a call from her lawyer, David. The phone call was brief, but the words he said hit her like a tidal wave. "Sarah," he said, "your parents are settling. They've agreed to the restitution and the other terms. It's over." Sarah felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The fight had been long, painful, and at times she had questioned whether it was worth it. But now, knowing that her parents had faced the consequences of their actions, she felt like she could finally let go of the weight she had carried for so long. It wasn't that she had gotten the revenge she had once dreamed of. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about justice. And it was about Sarah finally having the power to decide what was best for her life without the shadow of her parents' neglect hanging over her. That night, after hanging up the phone, Sarah stood by her window and looked out at the city lights. She had come so far from the woman who once felt abandoned and powerless. She had found her redemption, not in the approval of her family, but in the quiet strength that came from knowing she had reclaimed her life. She had proven that no matter how broken you are, no matter how far you've fallen, you can always rebuild. The past had no hold on her anymore. She had broken free, and in doing so had found something far more valuable than revenge. She had found peace. As Sarah continued to settle into her new role, she found herself increasingly focused on the future. She had become a leader in the hospital, advocating for patient care reform and offering support to those struggling with chronic illnesses. But with each passing day, she also realized that the healing she had done was not just about the system, it was about her. The work was rewarding, but it also brought its own challenges. Sarah faced difficult days where the emotional weight of the work took its toll. There were moments when she saw patients whose stories mirrored her own. And every time she spoke with a new patient, she was reminded of how far she had come. Every patient who left the hospital a little more hopeful because of her made it all worth it. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in her office preparing for an upcoming presentation, her phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. For a moment she hesitated. Who could it be? But with a deep breath, she answered. "Hello?" "Sarah, it's Jenna." The name sent a wave of unease through Sarah. She hadn't heard from her sister in months. Jenna had been silent ever since the trial, and Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to open that door again. But despite the hesitation, Sarah found herself saying, "Jenna, what's going on?" I've been thinking a lot about everything. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to say that I'm really sorry. I was wrong, Sarah. I've learnt so much in these months. I know I can't fix what's broken, but I wanted to reach out just to tell you that I see you and I understand now. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The words were difficult to process. Was this real? Was Jenna truly apologising? For a long moment, Sarah was silent. Her mind flashed back to the courtroom, to the hurtful things her parents had said, to the lies and excuses that had made everything harder. The last time they had spoken, it had been filled with bitterness and regret. Could she really open herself to forgiveness? "Jenna," Sarah said slowly, the words weighing on her, "I'm not ready to forgive you. Not yet. What you did, it hurt more than I can explain, but hearing you say this, it means something. I need time, but I'm willing to talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand," Jenna replied, her voice soft. "I'm here when you're ready, Sarah. I'll be patient. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." The conversation ended there, and Sarah sat back in her chair, staring out the window. A part of her wanted to shut down, to cut ties completely, but another part of her realised something important. Healing wasn't just about moving on, it was about giving herself permission to decide when to let go of the past and make space for something new. Whether or not she would ever fully forgive Jenna wasn't the question. It was about Sarah finding peace on her own terms. Days passed, and Sarah continued to grow in her role at the hospital, advocating for better patient care and working with healthcare providers to ensure that the needs of the most vulnerable were met. She knew that her journey had only just begun, and there was so much more she wanted to accomplish. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was truly living for herself, not for the approval of her family, but for her own peace, her own voice. Sarah's redemption was not just the result of a legal victory. It was about taking control of her life, creating a future that was hers alone, and finding the courage to embrace it. The days continued to pass, but now they felt different, lighter, as though with every breath Sarah took, she was shedding the last of the weight she had carried for so long. The days of feeling trapped by her family's expectations, the days of hiding her true emotions, of pretending that everything was okay, those days were over. Sarah had come to realize that healing wasn't a linear journey, but something fluid, evolving with time. And she was ready for it. Her role at the hospital had expanded, and she was now deeply involved in patient advocacy and outreach. Every day, she found herself talking to people who had faced their own battles, people who had been ignored, dismissed, or abandoned by the system. She spoke to those who had felt invisible and unheard, people who, like her, had experienced the deep loneliness of feeling like their needs didn't matter. And with each conversation, she grew more determined. There were days when she still questioned if she was strong enough to continue, if she had done enough to heal. It was easy to get lost in the doubts, to feel like she was still too broken to make a real difference. But when Sarah saw the impact she had on someone's life, when she helped a patient navigate the complexities of their care, or helped a struggling family find resources, she knew she was doing the right thing. Her life had meaning again. She had purpose. One evening, as Sarah was preparing for another conference, she received a text from Tara. It was simple, but it made Sarah smile. "I'm so proud of you. You've become everything I knew you could be." The words were a reminder that she wasn't alone in this journey. Tara had been there for her from the beginning, offering unconditional support, never questioning Sarah's decisions, even when they were hard to understand. But the most profound change Sarah experienced came in the form of self-acceptance. Over the years, she had tried so hard to prove herself, to be seen by her family, to be loved and accepted by people who would never understand. But now Sarah had learned that the only person who needed to accept her was herself. She no longer needed validation from anyone, least of all from the family that had rejected her. She was enough, just as she was. The most difficult thing she had done was letting go of the idea of what family was supposed to be. For years she had held on to the fantasy that her family would change, that they would eventually understand her, love her the way she deserved to be loved. But she had learned that family wasn't always defined by blood. It was defined by the people who showed up when you needed them, the ones who didn't abandon you when things got tough. Sarah found herself reconnecting with a new, chosen family. Her friends, the colleagues at the hospital, the patients whose lives she touched, all of these people filled the space that her biological family had once occupied. They didn't owe her anything, but they gave her everything. They were there for her, not because they had to be, but because they wanted to be. The process of forgiving her family wasn't something that could be rushed. Sarah knew that. But she also knew that forgiveness, in whatever form it would eventually take, would be on her terms when she was ready. For now, she didn't need to forgive them. She needed to move forward, and that's exactly what Sarah did. As Sarah continued her work at the hospital, something inside her shifted. It was subtle at first, a quiet confidence, a sense of peace that had once felt unattainable. She was no longer consumed by the need to prove herself to anyone. She had stopped searching for approval from the people who had never been able to give it to her. The freedom that came with that realization was a weight she hadn't even known she was carrying. She spent more time focusing on her new role in patient advocacy. Her work took on a different urgency now. Sarah wasn't just sharing her story, she was reshaping the narrative for patients who had been neglected, forgotten, and dismissed. Every time she spoke at a conference or helped a patient navigate the system, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was her life's work. This was where she belonged. One of the most profound moments for Sarah came when she met Dr. Evans, a compassionate doctor who had heard her speak at a community event. Afterward, he approached her with an offer that would change her career forever. "Sarah," he said, his voice kind but firm, "you've done incredible work already, but I think you have the potential to impact healthcare in ways you might not even realize yet. There's a position opening up in our hospital's outreach department. We need someone who understands the patient experience on a deep, personal level, someone who has lived it." Sarah's heart raced. She had always dreamed of making a difference in healthcare, but this was an opportunity to shape policies, to make real systemic changes that would reach far beyond the patients she interacted with every day. "I'm honoured, Dr. Evans," Sarah said, struggling to keep her voice steady, "but I don't know if I'm the right person. I've been through so much. I'm still learning, still healing." Dr. Evans smiled, his eyes filled with understanding. Sarah, that's exactly why you're the right person. You've fought for yourself. Now you can help others fight for the care they deserve. And you'll have the support you need to grow in this role. This is about more than just your experience. It's about your voice. In that moment, Sarah realized something important. She had already done the hardest part. She had fought for herself, survived the unimaginable, and emerged stronger than ever. Now it was time to use that strength to make the world a better place for others. She accepted the offer, knowing that this was the next step in her journey, a journey that was no longer defined by what her family had taken from her, but by what she was giving back to the world. Sarah's path forward wasn't going to be easy. There would be more challenges, more battles to fight, but she knew that each step would bring her closer to the woman she had always been meant to become, a woman who had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. And as Sarah walked into her new office on her first day, the weight of the past lifted just a little bit more. She wasn't defined by her struggles anymore. She was defined by her resilience, her ability to heal, and her unwavering commitment to helping others do the same. Sarah had finally found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first few months in her new position were a whirlwind. Sarah found herself in meetings with hospital administrators, doctors and social workers discussing policies and procedures that would ensure better patient care for those like her. She was no longer just advocating for herself, she was advocating for a community, for those whose voices had been silenced by the healthcare system. It was the kind of work that brought her a sense of purpose she had never known. But even with the new responsibilities and the sense of fulfillment she gained from her job, Sarah couldn't escape the nagging feeling that there were still parts of her life left unfinished. The relationship with her family was still fractured, and though she had found peace with her decision to move on, there were days when she wondered if reconciliation was possible. She had taken the necessary steps to move forward. She had rebuilt herself from the ground up. But somewhere deep inside, she still felt the pull of the past. The wounds from her family's betrayal had healed, but they hadn't disappeared. There was a lingering emptiness that nothing could fill. Then, one evening, as Sarah was sitting at her desk, she received an unexpected message. It was from Jenna, her sister. "I know we haven't talked in a long time," the message began, "and I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I want to say this. I'm truly sorry for everything. I was selfish, and I didn't realize how much I was hurting you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I love you, and I always have. I miss you." For a long moment, Sarah stared at the screen, her heart racing. Jenna's words were raw, vulnerable in a way that Sarah hadn't expected. It wasn't an apology for what had happened. It was an acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. It was, in its own way, a bridge. But Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to cross it. Taking a deep breath, Sarah sat back in her chair. She had spent so many years wishing for her family to come to their senses, wishing for them to see her, to love her in the way she had always needed. But the truth was, she couldn't live her life waiting for something that might never come. She had fought too hard to build a new life, one where she didn't need their approval or their love to survive. Still, there was something inside her that knew this message was important. Jenna had come to her on her own terms. It wasn't an apology given out of obligation or guilt. It was a moment of sincerity, a moment of growth. And that, in itself, meant something. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about accepting the reality of what had happened and learning to move forward from it. Taking a breath, Sarah typed her response. "I hear you, Jenna, and I appreciate your apology. I don't know what forgiveness looks like yet, but I'm willing to try. I'm not sure where we go from here, but I'm open to it. I'm ready to heal in my own way." As Sarah hit send, she felt a small weight lift off her shoulders. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future held with her family, but for the first time in years, she was no longer afraid of it. She had done the work to heal on her own. She had built a new life for herself, one that wasn't dependent on anyone else's acceptance or approval, and that, she realized, was the truest form of freedom. As Sarah looked out the window at the setting sun, she felt a sense of peace that had once felt out of reach. She had overcome so much. She had found her strength, her voice, and her purpose. The future was uncertain, but for the first time Sarah wasn't afraid of what it might bring. She was moving forward, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next.